My name is Renata Cole. I'm 39. My mother added my sister and me to her checking account 11 years ago, the week after her first cancer diagnosis, with the specific practical language she used for most decisions in her life. Just in case something happens and one of you needs to handle things quickly. The account held, at the time, around $40,000, her retirement transition fund, money she had moved out of a workplace retirement account when she left her job early to manage the first round of treatment, intended to cover her living expenses during a recovery period that, as it turned out, lasted far longer and required far more than either of us anticipated. My sister, Joelle, and I were both listed as joint account holders, full access, no restrictions, the kind of arrangement banks set up routinely for aging or ill parents who want their children to be able to act quickly if something happens. For 11 years, the account functioned exactly as intended. My mother's money, managed by my mother, with Joelle and me having access only when she explicitly asked one of us to handle something on her behalf, paying a bill while she was hospitalized, transferring funds for a specific expense she could not manage herself during a difficult stretch. 11 years of an arrangement that worked because everyone involved understood what it was actually for. Then, 6 weeks ago, my mother's oncologist told her that the treatments had stopped working, that the cancer had progressed beyond what further intervention could meaningfully address, and that the appropriate next step was hospice care, focused on comfort rather than treatment, with a realistic timeline measured in months rather than years. 4 days after that appointment, while my mother was still absorbing what the news meant, and before she had even told extended family, Joelle transferred $18,000 out of the joint account into her own personal account, in 3 separate transactions spread across 2 days. The specific structuring that someone uses when they understand, even unconsciously, that a single large transfer would draw more attention than several smaller ones. Before I tell you what I found when I started looking at the account history, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Only if this story is landing somewhere real. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to where this started. I need to tell you about my mother, Carol Whitfield, and about Joelle, and about the specific dynamic between us that made what happened both shocking and, in retrospect, not entirely surprising, because understanding that dynamic is essential to understanding why the joint account arrangement existed the way it did and why its misuse, when it finally happened, took the specific shape that it took. My mother worked for 32 years as a paralegal at a mid-sized law firm in Cincinnati, a career that gave her a front row seat over 3 decades to exactly how families fall apart over money and exactly how careful documentation and clear communication can prevent the worst of that falling apart. Lessons she absorbed professionally and tried, with varying success, to apply personally. She raised Joelle and me largely alone after our father left when I was 11, and Joelle was 8, a departure that, similar to other stories I have heard from people in situations like ours, was less a single dramatic event than a slow accumulation of absences that became permanent without anyone formally declaring it so. My mother did not remarry. She built a stable, careful life around her work and her 2 daughters, the kind of life that does not generate headlines but that requires a specific sustained competence that I did not fully appreciate until I became an adult managing my own financial life and understood exactly how much skill it takes to raise 2 children alone on a paralegal's salary without ever falling into the kind of crisis that derails families with fewer resources or less careful management. Joelle and I have always had a complicated relationship. The specific complication that exists between siblings who love each other genuinely and also compete in ways that were sometimes visible and sometimes not, for the limited resources, attention, and approval that exist within any family system. I am 2 years older than Joelle. I am, by most external measures, the more conventionally successful sibling, a senior financial analyst at a regional bank, married for 12 years to a husband named Marcus, who works as a civil engineer, 2 children, a house in a stable suburb. The the specific markers of stability that our mother, watching from the outside, has always seemed quietly proud of in a way she was careful not to express. Too directly because she understood, I think, how that pride could land on Joelle. Joelle's life has followed a different and more difficult trajectory. She struggled academically in ways I did not, was diagnosed with ADHD at 19 after years of difficulty that nobody had correctly identified earlier, and has worked, in the years since, in a series of adequate jobs without being stable, currently employed as a dental office coordinator, a job she has held for 3 years, longer than most of her previous positions, in a way that represents real progress relative to her own history, even though it does not match the external markers of stability that my own life happens to display. She has been married once, briefly, in her late 20s, a marriage that ended after 2 years for reasons that were complicated and that I do not think either of us fully understands even now. She has one daughter, Maddie, who is 11 from that marriage, and she has raised Maddie largely alone in the years since the divorce, with financial support that has been inconsistent from Maddie's father, and that has placed Joelle, throughout Maddie's childhood, in a specific ongoing financial precarity that I have watched from a position of relative comfort that has sometimes made our relationship feel uneven in ways neither of us has ever fully named directly. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters to understanding everything that follows. I have helped Joelle financially over the years, not constantly, not in the systematic pattern that some of the other stories on this channel describe, but periodically, when specific crises arose, a car repair she could not cover, a security deposit when she and Maddie needed to move to a new apartment after a landlord dispute, school supplies and clothes for Maddie at the start of certain school. Years when Joelle's budget was particularly tight. I did this because I loved my sister and my niece, and because I had the resources to help and chose to use them that way, not because anyone required it of me. And I want to be clear that I do not regret any of those specific decisions, even in light of what happened later, because I believe they were the right decisions made for the right reasons at the times I made them. My mother's first cancer diagnosis came 11 years ago. Breast cancer, caught at a stage that gave her doctors reasonable confidence in a good outcome with aggressive treatment, which she pursued and which was, for the following 9 years, apparently successful, with regular monitoring showing no recurrence and a quality of life that, while affected by the lasting physical effects of treatment, allowed her to continue working part-time and to maintain her independence in the small but comfortable condominium she had moved into. After Joelle and I were both grown, and the family house, which she had sold, had become more space than she needed or wanted to maintain alone. The week after her diagnosis, she called Joelle and me together, in the specific direct manner she has always used for important conversations, and told us she was adding us both to her checking account. She explained her reasoning clearly. I don't know what these next months are going to look like. I might need one of you to pay a bill while I'm in the hospital, or transfer money for something I can't manage from a treatment room. I want both of you to have access so that whoever is available at any given moment can act. I am not giving either of you this money. This is my account, my money, and I expect you to treat it that way, but I want the access to exist in case I need it. We both understood the arrangement exactly as she described it, and for 9 years, through the initial treatment and the recovery period and the years of monitoring that followed, the account functioned precisely as intended. I accessed it perhaps a dozen times over those years, almost always at my mother's explicit request, paying a specific bill while she was traveling or recovering from a procedure, transferring a specific amount for a specific purpose she had named directly. Joelle accessed it with similar frequency and similar specificity, and I want to note, because it matters to the contrast with what happened later, that in 9 years of joint access, neither of us ever took money from that account that our mother had not explicitly authorized for the specific purpose she named. The cancer returned 18 months ago, this time in a more advanced stage, metastasized beyond the original site, in a way that required a different and more aggressive treatment approach, with a prognosis that her oncologist described from the beginning of this second phase as serious but not immediately hopeless, the kind of careful clinical language that leaves room for genuine uncertainty about how the disease will respond to treatment. My mother pursued this second round of treatment with the same careful determination she had brought to everything else in her life. And for the first year of this second phase, the treatment appeared to be holding the disease at a manageable, if not improving, state. The account balance over these 18 months had grown somewhat from the original $40,000, as my mother continued to add to it from her pension and Social Security income while drawing down only what her treatment-related expenses required beyond what her insurance covered, reaching approximately $52,000 by the time of the appointment that changed everything. 6 weeks ago, my mother's oncologist delivered the news that the second round of treatment had stopped producing meaningful results, that the cancer had progressed to a point where further aggressive treatment was unlikely to extend her life meaningfully and would primarily extend her suffering, and that the recommended path forward was hospice care, focused entirely on comfort and quality of life. For whatever time remained, with the specific, honest acknowledgement from her doctor that the realistic timeline, based on the current rate of progression, was likely measured in months. My mother called me the evening of that appointment. I want to tell you about that call because it matters to the timeline of everything that followed. She was, in the specific way I have come to recognize across her 30 years of careful, controlled communication, processing something enormous with a calm exterior that I understood, even in the moment, was costing her considerable effort to maintain. She told me what the oncologist had said. She told me she had not yet told Joelle, that she wanted to process it herself for a day or two before having that conversation, and that she wanted to ask my advice about how to approach the conversation with Joelle, given Joelle's specific anxiety patterns and her tendency toward emotional overwhelm in crises. I want to be specific about the timeline here, because the specificity matters enormously to understanding what happened next. The appointment was on a Tuesday. My mother called me Tuesday evening. She told Joelle on Thursday. 2 days later, in a phone call that Joelle described to me afterward as the hardest conversation of her life, our mother explaining the prognosis with the same careful directness she used for everything, and Joelle, by her own account, falling apart in a way that frightened her, the specific kind of grief that arrives not as a single wave, but as a complete dissolution of the ability to function normally. I learned about the $18,000 transfers 11 days after that Thursday phone call when I logged into the joint account to check whether a specific medical expense reimbursement had processed correctly, a routine check that I performed periodically and that, on this particular occasion, revealed a transaction history I did not expect to find. 3 transfers, $6,000 each, executed on the Friday and Saturday immediately following Joelle's conversation with our mother, moving a total of $18,000 from the joint account into an account I did not recognize, which a quick search revealed to be Joelle's personal checking account at a different bank. I want to describe what I felt in that moment as precisely as I can, because I think the precision matters to understanding the conversation that followed. I did not feel immediate fury, though fury arrived eventually. What I felt first was a specific kind of disorientation. The feeling of looking at numbers that did not match the story I believed I was living inside. The 11 years of an arrangement that had functioned exactly as intended, suddenly producing a result I had never anticipated, and that did not fit anywhere in my understanding of how my sister and I operated within that arrangement. I called my mother first, not Joelle, because I needed to understand whether this was something my mother had authorized that I simply did not know about. Some specific arrangement she had made with Joelle directly that the joint account history alone could not explain. My mother answered on the second ring, her voice tired in the specific way it had been tired consistently since the hospice conversation. The particular exhaustion of someone managing both a terminal diagnosis and the emotional needs of everyone around her who was struggling to process that diagnosis. I said, "Mom, I need to ask you something about the account. Did you authorize Joelle to transfer $18,000 out of it last weekend?" There was a silence that told me, before she said a single word, that the answer was no. She said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "I was checking the account this morning, and I found 3 transfers, $6,000 each, moved into Joelle's personal account on Friday and Saturday. My mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I didn't authorize that. I haven't talked to Joelle about any transfer. I haven't talked to Joelle about money at all since I told her about the hospice decision." I want to tell you about the conversation I had with Joelle that followed, because I think the specific content of what she said and the specific way she said it matters to understanding both what had happened and how complicated the situation actually was beneath the surface of what initially looked like a straightforward theft. I called her that same evening. I did not lead with accusation, partly because I am, by professional training, someone who believes in establishing facts before concluding, and partly because some part of me, even with the bank records in front of me, wanted to believe there was an explanation that made this less terrible than it appeared. I said, "Joelle, I need to ask you about some transfers from Mom's account. $18,000 moved into your account last weekend. Can you tell me what that was about?" There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I almost asked again before she finally spoke. She said, "I can explain." I said, "Please do." She said, "After Mom told me about hospice, I had a complete breakdown. You know how I get with anxiety, and this was so much worse than anything I've dealt with before. I couldn't function. I couldn't go to work. I was lying on my bathroom floor for hours, just unable to move. And in the middle of that breakdown, my brain went to this place of total, catastrophic thinking about what happens to Maddie and me financially after Mom is gone. When the support I sometimes get from her, the occasional help with Maddie's expenses, the way she sometimes covers things when I'm short, all of that just stops permanently. And I thought about the account, and I thought, I need to make sure Maddie and I are okay. And I just acted on that fear without thinking it through properly. I know how it looks. I know it looks like I stole from her while she was dying. That's not what I meant to do. I was drowning, and I made a decision I shouldn't have made. I want to tell you what I believed and did not believe about that explanation, because I think the complexity of my response matters more than a simple verdict of guilty or not guilty would capture. I believed that Joelle's anxiety and grief reaction were real, because I have watched her experience anxiety crises across our entire adult relationship, and I know what they look like, and this matched that pattern. I believed that her underlying fear about financial security after our mother's death was real and not unreasonable, given her actual financial precarity and the actual role our mother's occasional support had played in her stability. What I did not believe, and could not make myself believe regardless of how much I wanted to extend her grace in this moment, was that the specific structuring of the transfers, 3 separate transactions of exactly $6,000 each rather than one transfer of $18,000, represented an unconsidered, purely impulsive action taken in a moment of total psychological collapse. That structure, in my professional experience analyzing financial transactions, reflects exactly the kind of deliberate threshold awareness that someone employs when they understand, even while in genuine distress, that transactions above a certain size trigger additional scrutiny or reporting requirements at most banks and structures their actions specifically to avoid that scrutiny. I said this to her as gently and as directly as I could manage. "Joelle, I believe you were in genuine distress. I don't believe a person having a total breakdown on their bathroom floor also has the presence of mind to structure transfers in exactly the pattern that avoids bank reporting thresholds. Those two things don't fit together for me. Can you help me understand that part specifically?" Long silence. Then, in a different voice, quieter, she said, "I looked it up. I want to be honest. I looked up what triggers a bank report, and I did the transfers in a way that wouldn't trigger one. I told myself it was just being careful, not doing anything wrong with the money, just being careful about the process. But I think, if I'm honest with myself, some part of me knew that what I was doing needed to be careful in that specific way, because some part of me knew it wasn't actually okay. I want to tell you what happened over the following days, because the resolution of this situation, like most of the stories I think matter on this channel, was not a single dramatic confrontation, but a complicated, multi-stage process involving several difficult conversations and an outcome that I believe was fair without being entirely comfortable for anyone involved. I told my mother everything Joelle had said, the explanation about the breakdown, the admission about deliberately structuring the transfers to avoid scrutiny, all of it, because I believed my mother, in the time she had remaining, deserved complete and accurate information about what had happened with her own money, rather than a filtered version that protected either Joelle or me from an uncomfortable conversation. My mother listened to all of it with the specific, exhausted clarity that I had watched her bring to every difficult medical conversation over the preceding 18 months. The particular competence of someone who has had to absorb terrible information repeatedly and has developed a capacity to process it without falling apart, even when falling apart would be an entirely reasonable response. She said, "Eventually, I need to talk to Joelle directly." I said, "Are you sure you have the energy for that right now, given everything else?" She said, "Renata, I have weeks or months left, by the doctor's own estimate. I am not going to spend any of that time avoiding a conversation that needs to happen because I'm worried about my own energy. This is exactly the kind of conversation I do have the energy for, because it's the kind of conversation that matters." The conversation between my mother and Joelle happened 2 days later, at my mother's condominium, with me present at my mother's specific request, because she said she wanted a witness who could help ensure the conversation stayed focused on what needed to be addressed rather than spiraling into the kind of emotional overwhelm that had characterized Joelle's reaction to the original hospice news. My mother began by stating the facts plainly, the way she has always approached difficult conversations: the specific dollar amount, the specific dates, the specific structuring of the transactions. She said, "Joelle, I need you to return this money. Not because I don't understand that you're frightened about your financial future. I do understand that, and I want to address that fear directly and separately from this conversation. But I need you to return this money because it wasn't yours to take, and because the way you took it, the specific, careful structuring to avoid detection, tells me that some part of you knew that while you were doing it, even if you weren't able to fully process that knowledge in the moment, given everything else you were dealing with." Joelle cried through most of the conversation. The specific, overwhelmed crying that I had described to my mother in our earlier conversation, but she did not deny what had happened or attempt to minimize it further. She said, "I'll return it. I'm sorry, Mom. I don't know how to explain how scared I am about what happens to Maddie and me." I said, "I think you do know how to explain it, Joelle. You just explained it really clearly to me on the phone. The problem isn't that you can't explain the fear. It's that you acted on the fear in a way that hurt Mom and that you tried to hide." My mother said something then that I have thought about many times since, because I believe it captures something important about how she approached not just this specific situation, but her entire approach to parenting two very different daughters across difficult circumstances. She said, "Joelle, I am going to address your fear about the future directly, right now, separately from the question of returning this money, because I don't want those two things tangled together in a way that makes it seem like I'm only willing to help you if you give the money back first. Here is what I want you to know. I have a will. It divides what remains of my estate, after this illness has taken its toll on my savings, equally between you and Renata, with a specific additional provision for Maddie's education that I set up 2 years ago, when I first understood that this illness might progress in ways that would limit what I could provide for her directly while I'm alive. You are not going to be left with nothing when I'm gone. I have tried to plan for exactly the fear you're describing, carefully and legally, rather than in a way that requires you to take money secretly out of fear that nothing has been planned at all." Joelle returned the $18,000 within a week, transferring it back to the joint account in a single transaction, which I noted, without commenting on it directly to her, was itself a small but specific signal that she was no longer trying to structure her financial actions to avoid scrutiny, that the returning of the money was meant to be visible and complete rather than quietly walked back in a way that minimized its appearance. I want to tell you about the conversation Joel and I had, separately from our mother, about a week after the money was returned, because I think it represents the actual emotional resolution of this situation more completely than the financial transaction itself did. She called me and said, "I want to talk about what happened, just between us, not because Mom is making us or because there's anything else that needs to be returned or fixed. I just want you to understand, if you're willing to let me explain again, in a way that isn't just an excuse." I said, "I'm listening." She said, "I have spent my entire adult life watching you build a life that looks stable from every angle, and watching myself fail to build anything that looks stable from any angle. And I have told myself, for years, that I don't resent you for that I'm happy for you and grateful when you help me and not comparing myself to you in ways that make me bitter. And I think, when Mom told me about hospice, all of that bitterness that I had been telling myself didn't exist came out sideways in this specific terrible way, because some part of me thought, if Mom dies and the help stops, I am going to be the one left struggling while Renata continues being fine. And that thought made me do something I am deeply ashamed of. I said, "Joelle, I don't think you're a bad person. I think you did something wrong. And I think you need to sit with why you did it rather than just feeling ashamed and moving past it quickly. The resentment you're describing, I don't think that's irrational. I think it's understandable, given how different our lives have looked. But understandable doesn't mean it justifies what you did. And I think the work you actually need to do isn't about apologizing to Mom or me anymore. It's about understanding why that resentment built up the way it did and probably talking to someone professionally about it. Because I don't think this is the last time that fear is going to surface if you don't address where it's actually coming from." She has been, in the weeks since, seeing a therapist for the first time in her adult life, a decision she told me she made specifically because of this situation. Because the conversation with me had made her understand that the resentment and fear she had been managing privately for years needed professional attention rather than continued private management that had, at the moment of greatest stress, produced a decision she deeply regretted. I want to tell you about my mother in the weeks since this happened, because I think her response to the entire situation reflects something important about how she has approached her remaining time, with the same careful, deliberate clarity she brought to 30 years of paralegal work and to raising two very different daughters through a single difficult childhood and into two very different adult lives. She told me, in a conversation we had recently, sitting together at her condominium during one of my now twice weekly visits, that she did not regret setting up the joint account 11 years ago, despite what had happened. She said, "Renata, that account did exactly what I needed it to do for 11 years. It let you and Joelle help me quickly when I needed help quickly, through 2 cancer diagnoses and years of treatment in between. What happened at the end doesn't erase 11 years of it working correctly. It just means I had to have a hard conversation I wish I hadn't needed to have, at a time when I would have preferred to spend my remaining energy on other things. But I don't regret the trust I placed in both of you by setting it up the way I did, even though that trust was, in one specific moment, misused. I want to talk to you directly now, wherever you are, whatever time it is. The joint account my mother set up 11 years ago was built on a specific, narrow trust. Access in case of emergency, not unrestricted permission. And for nearly all of those 11 years, that distinction held completely. Because both my sister and I understood it and respected it even when we had the literal legal ability to do otherwise. What broke, in the end, was not the legal structure of the account. It was a moment of genuine human fear, compounded by years of unaddressed resentment that led my sister to use access she had been given for one purpose toward a completely different purpose, in a moment when our mother was least equipped to notice or respond. If you have joint access to a parent's account, financial or otherwise, please understand that the access itself is not the permission. The access exists to let you act on someone else's explicit behalf in moments they cannot act for themselves, not as a standing authorization to act on your own behalf whenever your own circumstances feel urgent enough to justify it. And if you are the parent setting up that access, please understand that the trust you are placing requires, eventually, an explicit conversation about what happens to your children financially after you are gone, because the absence of that conversation creates exactly the kind of catastrophic fear that led my sister to make a decision she will spend a long time working to fully understand and forgive herself for. My mother has weeks or months remaining by her doctor's most recent estimate. She is spending them with the same clarity she has brought to everything else in her life, including the hardest conversation she has had to have in a very long time, because she believes, and I have come to believe alongside her, that hard conversations had directly and honestly are always better than the alternative, the quiet accumulation of fear and resentment that eventually finds its way out, sideways, in moments when the people we love are least prepared to absorb it. That is today's story on the Family Ledger. Leave a comment wherever you are watching from. Tell me what time it is and whether you have ever had joint access to something that tested the difference between what you were legally able to do and what you actually should do. I read every single one. Subscribe for the next story every week. Check the description for another one I think you will connect with. Thank you for being here.